Good morning and welcome to the Morning Scoop for Thursday, December 31st. This is your daily Buckeye fix. I'm Tom Orr. The Sugar Bowl against Clemson is tomorrow. The game against Michigan in 331 days. We've had a lot of great content on Buckeye Scoop this week in the lead up to the Sugar Bowl, but as usual, some of my absolute favorite stuff is from our X's and O's guru, Ross Fulton. He is my guest this morning. Ross, on the surface, it seems like the Buckeyes and Tigers run pretty similar offenses, but as you explained earlier this week, there are some substantial differences as well.
Yeah, so to me, Clemson is much more of what you'd think of as a sort of stereotypical college spread offense, in the sense like a lot of it, there's a lot of read plays, more like what Urban Meyer did. Everything's predicated on that read run game, a lot of screens, a lot of run pass options, and not as much of a what you think of as like an NFL style passing game. Whereas like Ohio State, as like Ryan Day and Kevin Wilson like to describe, they're really running a pro style passing game with a college run offense. And even that, it's like they run from the shotgun, but a lot of it is wide zone and mid zone, like we've talked about, which are really, plays you see in the NFL all the time. So it's much more of a pro style system with the quarterback in the shotgun, with the occasional, quarterback run or read play sprinkled in.
And I'm sure Ohio State fans probably don't need a reminder of this, but one of the things Clemson does pretty well is get guys like Trevor Lawrence and Travis Etienne out in space. That was something that really hurt the Buckeyes a lot last year. Can you explain why the OSU defense was so effective against a lot of Clemson's wide receivers last season, but then also vulnerable against Lawrence running and Etienne in that passing game?
Yeah, so one of the reasons I think that Ryan Day, when he became the head coach, wanted to go to this single high cover 3, cover 1 scheme is it's very effective against run pass options because, we've talked about this, but before Northwestern game, but when you only have that single safety, you can cover up every wide receiver. And so especially if you're playing man coverage on those receivers, there's nothing to read. There's no one in conflict because each of those defenders are playing man coverage on their opponent. And then the quarterback is left, trying to fit the ball into a tight window. And the other thing that Ohio State did, and Jeff Hafley actually talked about this week, is they thought that they could be successful pressing the Clemson wide receivers last year. And obviously the Clemson wide receivers last year were much more bigger physical guys. And so, again, when you're fully covering up, when I say that, essentially, you're lining up head on head on those receivers, you have the opportunity to do that. But the problem is then, as we talked about, is especially if you're in man coverage and you have those defensive backs turn with their backs and they're worried about the wide receiver they're on, that leaves one, maybe two guys to tackle a Trevor Lawrence or a Travis Etienne in space. And if they miss, it's going to lead to a big play. Whereas if you're playing zone, you have more defenders whose eyes are on the football.
So what do you expect to see more from the defense this week? You think they go to the, kind of like one deep, everyone's covered across the field, turn and run man, or more of like a cover 3, cover 4, like a zone and try and keep things in front of them? What are you expecting to see from the defense this week?
Yeah, I expect more zone than they played last year. I mean, obviously, like last year, they would mix in a lot of cover 3, cover 1. This year, especially the last few games, they've been pretty much overwhelmingly cover 3. And part of that's personnel. Part of that is just, I think, after Indiana, like all those shifts and adjustments, like we talked about, just caused like problems and breakdowns, like those big plays. So I think they wanted to simplify things, keep the ball in front of them, and tackle. And so I think we see a lot more zone against Clemson than they did last year. I think that is some trade-offs. I think it'll be a little bit easier for Clemson to complete some of those run pass options or like middle of the field routes. On the other hand, I do zone read and Lawrence keeping or Etienne on screens or swings out of the backfield. I do think, to your point about cover 4, I do think they'll have to use some of that to defend the quarterback read, because while the single high structure is really good for run pass options, it's less effective against read plays. And so I think that you'll see more split safeties mixed in than we've seen this year. And I also think you'll see more nickel than Ohio State's played this year.
So to you, what is the biggest matchup concern you would have for the Ohio State defense?
The same ones as last year, which is Lawrence running / Etienne in space. I mean, again, just because the defense isn't really designed for a lot of the replays. I mean, Clemson, they're, to their credit, they'll stress you across the field because all the plays work together. As I showed in my article, they'll show a toss pitch to ETN one way and then run Lawrence on a counter tray with two guard, the guard and the tight end pulling the other way, or then they'll fake that and then they'll throw a little dump route into the seam. And so you have to be on point, and it stresses you in terms of playing assignment football. But Rodgers is a good receiver in the slot. They'll work to get him open. I know a lot of people are concerned about Marcus Williamson and coverage on him, but again, I don't think Ohio State's going to play a ton of man. And when they do, I think they'll try to use it in that way to press and kind of throw Clemson off their game. But I think it's really a question of stopping the big two, especially first and foremost running the football, and then force Clemson. I know it's strange to say with Trevor Lawrence probably being the best NFL prospect since Andrew Luck, but force Clemson to rely basically on a drop back mid-range passing game, because that's just really not what they want to do. They want to create big explosive plays off of getting the defense out of position.
Well, that was going to be my next question. So what puts Ohio State in a position to do better than people are expecting defensively? But I mean, it sounds like maybe what Ohio State is going to try and funnel them into doing is something they don't really want to do. So that I would guess that's the answer there.
Yeah. So I think first and foremost, I think they need to control the interior against the run. I mean, I think Clemson's offense is still predicated around running the football inside with, inside zone plays and gap or counter or power plays. And so, the one place where Ohio State has a definitive advantage is their defensive line against Clemson's offensive line, particularly the defensive tackles against the Clemson interior. So that's where they need to control the game. They then need to be able to, when Clemson tries to get the ball out on the edges, to tackle, play well in the flats, not let those guys get loose. And then, Clemson's going to complete some passes, obviously. And it's really just a matter of getting guys on the ground and not letting those turn into 60-yard touchdowns.
Well, on the other side of the ball, we've heard a lot about how Clemson defensive coordinator Brent Venables likes to try and confuse opponents. So what does he do that's so deceptive?
A lot. So they have a very extensive playbook. He will show a lot of safety rotation, right? So that's one thing that Justin Fields has struggled with. So 2 high safeties go to 1 to 2. Or even bring a linebacker back as a safety. A lot of zone blitzes. So you don't know where the rush is coming from, so he'll bring 5 or 6 and play like a cover 3 shell. So you still have the 3 deep defenders, but only 2 or 3 guys in the underneath zones. And again, the trade-off is, we're going to count on that preventing the blitz turning into a big play against us and then come up and tackle or confuse the quarterback. And so he'll show a lot of looks, a lot of post-snap motion, a lot of shifting and slanting, because the reality is, just from a pure talent standpoint, Clemson on defense isn't at the Alabama or even the Ohio State level, especially up front or at safety. And so a lot of it is just causing confusion for the defense. Well, or for the offense.
One of the things you wrote this week about was how mid-game adjustments that Clemson made last year when Ohio State was kind of having their way with the Tigers a little bit in the early part of that Fiesta Bowl. And then they went to what's called the 3-3-3 broken stack alignment in last year's game. And that, all of a sudden Ohio State wasn't running the ball as well. And as you pointed out in the article, not having J.K. Dobbins out there after he hurt his ankle probably helped with that a lot as well. But can you explain what the 3-3-3 broken stack alignment is? And if that's something you think the Buckeyes might see again tomorrow?
Yeah, so basically, as the name implies, you got 3 defensive linemen, and they're lined up in what's called an odd front. And so that just means that the nose guard is head up on the center. And then you have 3 linebackers and 3 safeties. And the middle safety, who was Isaiah Simmons last year, so obviously they don't have that kind of player this year, is kind of like in a quasi-safety linebacker role. So he can come down really quick to play the run. He can drop back as a safety, and they can bring the other 2 safeties down. Again, it just gives Venables another way to confuse the offense, because you just now have moving pieces as to who's going to be the safety, who's going to be the linebacker, where's the rush coming from. It confused Ohio State in the run game in terms of identifying how to work their zone combo blocks. And obviously the one thing I would expect it. I mean, I think Ohio State has to expect it. I think Venables has not quite used as much of that this year because I think they have a 4 defensive linemen they trust more than last year with the 2 freshmen. And they don't quite have that Isaiah Simmons guy that can be all over the field from a deep safety coming up to the line of scrimmage. But, with the success they had with it, Ohio State certainly has to be prepared for it.
Well, you mentioned earlier that one of Ohio State's big advantages on the defensive side of the ball was maybe being able to control the line of scrimmage, especially in the interior of the line. And it seems like on the other side of the ball, one of the things Ohio State could do to potentially have a chance to control the game would be able to, again, own the line of scrimmage, run the ball consistently. Does the Ohio State run game set up well to have success against this Clemson defense?
Yes. Again, I think that Ohio State has to count on their offensive line being able to control the line of scrimmage. Clemson has two talented freshman defensive linemen, but they're freshmen. If that is not, I don't expect Clemson to line up and just try to go sort of toe to toe with the Ohio State offensive line. I think you'll see a lot of shifts, a lot of slanting. And so, the key is for the offensive line to work together in terms of identifying what's going on. And then, as I talked about in my article, Ohio State had a lot of success last year with Dobbins cutting the football back behind the slanting. And, Trey Sermon had a lot of success doing that against Northwestern. And so I think, Ohio State's going to need more of that. And they're also going to need a heavier dose of Justin Fields in the run game than they've used.
You've mentioned those true freshmen on that defensive line a couple of times. And, whenever you hear true freshman, in my head, you always go, okay, you should be able to take advantage of that some way because these guys have not played enough football. You hear the veterans talk about the fact that, after 5 years, Justin Hilliard has seen everything. Tuff Borland has seen everything. You can't surprise them. These guys are still true freshmen. Is that something that Ohio State might be able to exploit to get them out of position, confuse them with stuff they haven't seen before? Is that doable? And if so, what types of things would you use to do that?
Yeah, I think that Ohio State can do some things up front in terms of the run game. They haven't used, for instance, a lot of counter Trey this year. And that's the thing where if Clemson's slanting, they can really wash those guys down if they're not, expecting that to sort of break back to the backside. I think in general, one thing that's been talked about a lot this week is Brent Venables stealing signs. And one way, there's a couple ways Ohio State can deal with that. They can go very quick tempo before those defensive linemen line up because Clemson likes to wait a long time to signal in. They can huddle, or they can also use a lot of pre-snap motion and shifts, which will force Clemson because, the running a complex defense, there's two sides of the coin, right? You have lots of potential answers, but it also takes lots of getting lined up correctly. And so I would expect when Ohio State isn't going fast tempo to see a lot of, they'll flip the two tight ends from one side of the formation to the other, or you'll get a guy going in motion and then coming back. So I would expect a lot of motion in general to try to confuse the entire Clemson defense.
One of the ways they kind of took advantage of Clemson, not necessarily being lined up or taking a little bit of time to get set up last year was, you remember there was, I think, a 4th and 1 where they were in shotgun and Justin Fields kind of like walked up to the line and was sort of pointing and, hey, moving guys around. And then all of a sudden, got down, took a snap, and the Clemson defensive line wasn't ready, and they just blew them 4 yards back, and it was the easiest first down they got all game. It'll be interesting to see what they have saved up. They had that was one last year that was like, ooh, that was new. You didn't have to think real hard. That was something you haven't seen before. And the one of the things, this is another thing you mentioned, was they were pretty effective in the underneath zones against Clemson last year. You get the guys blitzing, get the safeties back, but there's sometimes you got those just two guys in the shorter zones. Is that something that might be there again this year for Ohio State? And if so, what kind of looks or plays would you look for them to use to capitalize on that?
Yeah, I think it's going to be because either a combination of two things. Against Ohio State last year, Clemson liked to use a lot of cover 3 to get an additional run defender down. That's what they did as well against Notre Dame in the ACC championship, which also is a very good run offense. And so, I expect a lot of that. So again, those quick pitches and outs that we've talked about a lot should be there. I also think, as you mentioned, Clemson will use a lot of zone blitzes where they only have 2 or 3 underneath defenders instead of the usual 4 or 5. And so I think, plays you saw a lot of at the end of the game last year when Ohio State finally got rolling against that broken stack look, which was the shallow curl and then combined with J.K. Dobbins on a swing route right away. I would, look for a lot of those plays where Fields can get the ball out of his hands. I personally think that on a lot of their pass plays, rather than leaving Sermon into block, which a lot of times what Clemson will do is if they'll just send another blitzer who will wait and see if the running back stays into block. I would just release him right away just to give Fields some quick outlets that he knows are there. Because again, the key is I think you want to combine, basically you want to be able to run the ball well. Then you have to combine that with a bunch of quick throws that hit those underneath zones to stay ahead of the chains and minimize their use of, more exotic zone blitzes. And then, the third thing is you scheming up to get Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave singled up on their safeties to throw the ball deep, especially in the first half with Nolan Turner out.
Yeah, and that was going to be kind of my next question is what would you see tomorrow night that would make you think this Ohio State offense might be having a better night than I was expecting them to, or the Clemson defense might be having a better night than I was expecting them to? Like what would be something, that if Ohio State fans see this, it would mean, hey, you might be in for a good night, and if they see something else, they might be in for a bad night.
Yeah, so the first thing is running the ball successfully. Obviously if they're getting beat up front or getting stopped for minimal yards, I think that's problematic. Obviously, I think, Clemson will create some negative plays, but you want to have your hits where you find an opening that counteract that. Then I personally would like to see early the ball getting out of Justin Fields' hands quickly. I want to see like 5-yard, 8-yard routes to get him in a rhythm that let him identify the defense. I think personally, like going with some quick rocket tempo early with some of those quick passes will be good to let him to simplify the coverage and let him see. And then, I want to see formations and shifts where they basically get Olave or Wilson singled up, on a corner or a safety without help, because I think Ohio State will take that one-on-one situation anytime.
Well, Ross, I appreciate you joining us. We went a little longer than we typically do, but I have a feeling people are probably okay with that. You can find both of Ross's articles. He did one on the Ohio State defense and the Clemson offense, and then one on the other side of the ball for both teams. You can find those both at buckeyescoop.com. Absolutely positively worth your time. Both of them can sound a little smarter while you're talking with your friends during the game tomorrow night. So, Ross, thank you for joining me. Tony Gerdeman and I will be in New Orleans. We'll be here all the way through the end of the game. We will have a ton of coverage all throughout today and tomorrow in the lead up to the game. So make sure you check that all out at buckeyescoop.com. Also, make sure you check out our podcasts. We have a ton of shows. Our shows, Alex Gleitman had on a Clemson writer on his Around the Oval podcast earlier this week. Lots and lots of great content, insight, and analysis. You can find all of that on whatever your podcast platform of choice is: Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, Spotify. Just search Buckeye Scoop to find all of those. You can subscribe right there. Also, leave us a 5-star rating and review while you're doing it. So thank you guys for listening. Have a great day. We will talk to you tomorrow.